Well, Ecclesiastes, the author of Ecclesiastes, is talking about seasons. And we know seasons right now, right? We are in the season of winter. And for some of us, it may seem like the season is never going to end. For some of us, it seems like our toes will always be cold or our hands will always be cold. And when we look at the gray skies, we wonder, is the sun going to come out more days than not? Is there anything going on? It feels like everything is dead and dormant and quiet, and it can be kind of sad and depressing at times. But we know there is something else going on. I mean, most of us have experienced spring. We may have a distant memory of it, but we've experienced it, and we know it's coming, but we have to choose to have hope. You see, hope is a choice. And you wonder sometimes if just because spring is coming and we've experienced it before, do we still have the hope that spring is coming? Because hope is something that grows within us. Maybe others can't see it, but it gives us a lightness to our step and a depth to our heart. So we have to choose if we will let that hope grow in us. You know, the writer of Ecclesiastes does not seem to have any hope. I mean, if you read the whole book, it sounds pretty sad. It makes me think of Eeyore from the Winnie the Pooh stories. You know, it seems like whatever anybody asks Eeyore what's going on, he is always going to end his statements with a hopeless phrase. For example, one morning Rue says, "Good morning, Eeyore." And Eeyore says, "Good morning, if it's a good morning," which I doubt. And you're like, all he said was good morning. And then one day, Christopher Robin is reattaching Eeyore's tail. And he says, "Did I get it on properly?" And Eeyore says, "No matter. It'll fall off again." And you just kind of feel sorry for Eeyore, don't you? But all of us have had Eeyore moments in our life. When we've been in that rough time of life, that difficult time of life. Maybe we knew we were in it. Maybe it took us a while before we understood that we were in the middle of a storm. And what do we do when we're in the middle of the storm? Well, we don't know. Because often when you're in the middle of a storm, you don't know you're in the middle. You don't know when the end is coming. But what this scripture teaches us and tells us, if you take away all the other words, what this scripture says is that God has ordered things, and we can trust in that. And it says that God has put eternity in our hearts. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to tell you what it means for me. And it may not be the same for you, but I hope that you'll help understand a little bit of what it means, because what it means is that God is transforming our hearts right now. Can you see it? Can we see that spring is coming? But we know it is. God is transforming our hearts even when we can't see it. And there are times in our life when that transformation is more. And I think those times are often when we are in the storms of life, when life is the roughest. And so I'm going to tell you about mine. And if there's a few tears, please forgive me. It's just the way life goes. But 2014, my mom called me and said, "My doctor says I have stage 4 colon cancer." Whoo, Mom, that's not a fun conversation to have. What are we going to do about this? And so my mom and my dad packed up and moved to Virginia because we have a great doctor in the family, and they wanted to be close to family. And so we started this journey together. Now, I want to be clear. I have a different cancer journey than my mom's. So I'm sharing with you today my journey of walking with my mom through her cancer. And my journey was different, and I think a lot of you understand the kind of journey I had, because it's a journey of someone who has loves someone who has a terminal disease and who is still living in the regular world. I still had to do laundry, and I still had to do dishes, and I still had to come to work. And also, I had to go to chemo and hold my mom's hand. And also, I had to take her to doctor's appointments. And also, man, I wanted to reschedule some of those doctor's appointments. because they just weren't convenient for me. But when you're facing cancer, you don't reschedule doctor's appointments. You go religiously. And when you have cancer, you go very, very often. And so we were going with my dad and mom to those appointments, to those chemo treatments, and then the time in between when we were giving her all the nutrients we could to keep her feelings up, her body up, all of those things. And in that time, I felt hopeless and helpless. I didn't know how this journey was going to go. And in the beginning of it, all I kept doing was trying to do everything we could to save mom. We wanted to do everything we could. We read every website. We looked at every book. We talked to every doctor, and we kept on keeping on. And I kept holding her hand in the hard times. And then in those times when the doctor would say, well, we're cautiously optimistic. Let me tell you what cautiously optimistic feels like. It feels like fear. Because every time the doctor would say, well, we're cautiously optimistic, it would feel to us like that means we can't let go. We can't take a breath. We can't rest. We have to keep going at this pace. And so we did. We kept going. Now, the reason I remember some of this time is I kept a prayer journal during that time. And I have to tell you that many times in that prayer journal, I asked God, why? Until I stopped believing there was a God at all. Just for a brief moment, but we've all been there. That doubt crept in, and it just seemed like the world was so heavy on us, and there seemed to be no break from this thing called cancer. And I just felt like I was drowning, and I couldn't let my mom know. She had enough on her plate. I needed help too, but how could I ask for help when I'm not the one with the terminal disease? And so it was a very difficult time. And in that time, instead of asking for help, I got into myself and just took care of myself. And that selfish thinking starts to cause doubt that God even cares. That cautiously optimistic meant that I couldn't take a breath. And you know, when you have cancer or a terminal disease, you wonder, what should I pray for? Should I pray for healing? Because I did that. I started by praying for healing. And then I started praying for a cure. And then I started praying for no evidence of disease, which I learned along the way. And I prayed for all of these things, and it seemed like none of those things came along. And then there was some moment in this journey, which turned out to be 6 years, but I didn't know that at the time. There was some moment in this journey when I started to see God shifting my heart. You see, that doubt that crept in because of me, God never left. So God kept pouring into me and kept changing my heart, even though I couldn't see it. And my heart started to transform, as the scripture says, bending towards heaven and understanding that eternity is within us. And so then I started to pray for death. It was a different kind of prayer, though. It wasn't because I wanted my mom to go, but because I wanted her to feel better. I wanted her burdens to be gone and for them to be lifted. And I knew I had to let go of holding her hand to give her hand to Jesus. It was not my journey to go on. Now, during that time, I still was a pastor. I still smiled. I still came to church every Sunday, and I still did funerals. And I walked with others who were in similar situations. And there is this dear woman named Margaret who was caring for her husband, who also had a terminal disease, and he had Alzheimer's. And so it was especially difficult because he didn't know to say, I love you anymore. And some days he didn't know who she was. And this journey went on for many, many years. And then we had the funeral. And at the funeral reception, I overheard some people saying, you know, she must not have loved him that much, because I didn't see her cry at the funeral. I didn't see any tears. She sat up straight, and she just seemed like she was glad this was over. And you know, she is his second wife. I couldn't believe what I had heard. And I thought about confronting them, but I didn't. I didn't have the courage in that moment. But I thought about it over and over again. And what I realized, because I had journeyed with her, is that there was a sense of relief. Because this woman had a deep, deep, deep faith that only grew the more she cared for her husband. And she told me that God had been with her through every step of this season of her journey of life. And so now that her husband was at peace, she knew God was starting a new season in her. And she didn't know what that season was going to be, but she knew that God would be with her. She had trust and confidence that God would be with her because she said he had never left her. And it made me think again about the seasons, that we can't always see what's going on the inside, but God is still working in our hearts just like God is working in the seasons. And John Wesley called all of what we're talking about here this heaviness. I'm glad he didn't come up with a boring term for it. It's called heaviness. And what he defined it as, he says, you can rejoice in sorrow. God can still work through broken hearts. And even when we are at rock bottom, God can still grow our hearts. And that was what I was learning. Again, I was in the middle of a storm too, but I didn't know that I was in the middle. I doubted my faith. I doubted my job. I doubted all sorts of things. And there are times I just wanted to run away and be someone different and do something different so that I didn't have to carry these burdens anymore. But God was bending my heart towards heaven. And God kept carrying me and accepting my doubts and loving me anyways and showing me that God was near. And that is when my faith was growing. Now, most of us understand faith as believing in Jesus, and that is what John Wesley said his first belief was. But he said there came a time later when he understood to expand that definition to trust and confidence in God. Do you believe? Can you trust that God is taking care of you? Do you have confidence in God's ordering of your life? Well, when you're facing a journey like I was and you learn you don't have control, you have to learn to let go. And do you just throw it up all in the air? Or do you give it to the arms of Jesus? You know, I look through that time in my life and I have to say, there are times I regret. There were times I was upset and I yelled at my mom. Man, she could be stubborn. You know, there were times that I embraced my mom. There were times that we worried together, and there were times that I just kept thinking, her anxiety is going to overwhelm me. There are times that we were sad together. And I look over all of those times and I take them as a gift now. Because all of that time was stretching me and growing my faith. It is really kind of funny, isn't it? Something that we would never choose for ourselves becomes one of the greatest gifts we've ever received. I would never choose cancer for myself or anyone, but it is the time that I grew the most in my faith. You know, faith isn't only belief, I learned. It is also surrender. Now, there's another piece to this story. My father was on this journey with us, and his part of the story is different, but I will tell you this from my perspective. When mine and Robert's hearts started turning towards heaven, and we started letting go of trying to control the outcome of mom's illness, when we started to try to help and bring her comfort instead of cure, my dad did not take it well. We were on the same journey, but we were in different places. And when it came time to sign the hospice papers, we couldn't find Dad. It was in that moment in the hallway that my dad said to me something I had never known before. That when he was in California, he was still the oldest son in a family of 5. And he had gotten a phone call that his father had had a heart attack and was unconscious. And so he flew to Texas to be with his father, to find out when he walked in the room that his mother was saying, "We asked you to come so you could sign the hospice papers." And he looked at me and he said, "I killed my father." And I said, "No, Dad, you did not. We don't have that power." And so together we signed those papers. And my dad was still not ready. But the good news, I can tell you in another story some other time. Months and months later, when he came back to the church that had loved us through that whole crisis, and he gave his testimony that their faith had held him up when he had no more faith. So I learned through this journey that faith is belief in Jesus, but it is also surrender. And God earned my trust and my confidence, even though God shouldn't have to, but he did. Part of turning our hearts to heaven is always becoming more like Christ so that our minds are more like Christ. You know, when I fell in love, I started learning what all those sappy love songs meant. They finally started making sense. When I had this time of sorrow in my life, I finally understood what the writer says when he says, "When sorrows like sea billows roll, I have learned to say, it is well with my soul." So for those of you today, how do you make it through? How do you make it through the storms of life? Maybe it's not terminal disease. Maybe it's the loss of a job or finances. Maybe it's broken relationships. Maybe it's trauma from your past. How do you make it through? Well, I'm a visual person. So I'll tell you what comes to me now from this journey that I went on. Y'all ever seen that movie Twister, the old version? There's this time in the movie where two of the characters see the funnel cloud coming, and they have to find shelter. They have to hunker down, and everything can be taken away in a tornado. And so finally, they find this pipe that is sunk deeply into the ground, and they tie themselves to this, and the storm passes through, and they hold on for dear life. That is why Jesus gives us the cross, because we can tie ourselves to the cross. And my mom tied herself to the very same cross, even though our journeys were different. You know, a new season of life came for me. And it took me a long time in my grief to understand that a new season had come for my mom as well. I can't see what her season looks like, but I know what mine looks like. It is a deeper faith. It is more trust. And you know what? I am no longer afraid of those little tiny storms I used to be afraid of. I'm not afraid of all the little things that I used to worry about, like passing a test, or getting someplace on time, or being liked. I know now what really, really matters. I'm still learning, you guys. I'm not done yet. Obviously, I'm still here. We still have a long way to go. And as the scripture says, God has given us a purpose in this season and ordering to our life. And God is transforming our hearts and putting in us that bend toward heaven, that bend towards being able to let go of what we're holding on so tightly and put it into the hands of Jesus. And I did that visually when we walked into the hospital room for the last time. I took my mom's hand and I put it into the hand of Jesus. And I know there was healing in that moment. Now, finally, there's this popular song right now, and in case you're not cool, I want you to know this cool new song. You're going to be able to leave here today and say, "I am cooler." It's by a man named Jelly Roll. Y'all know Jelly Roll? So I wish I could play this song for you, but there's copyright laws. And I wish I could have played this song for the person who wrote Ecclesiastes. But I'm so glad he wrote it. I'm so glad he leaves this testimony of grief and doubt and worry and storms so that we know we are not alone. And here is what Jelly Roll sings. I know I can't be the only one who's holding on for dear life, but God knows, I know, when it's all said and done, I'm not okay, but it's all gonna be all right, gonna be all right. I know one day we'll see the other side, the pain will wash away in a holy water tide, and we're all gonna be all right.